convicted by that song, by the Spirit. And I just want to say, Ray, for me, I think it's also the vulnerability that you show that just really connects me. And I'm just very grateful. I know today especially, and what we're going to talk about can be challenging, and you show up for it. And that's a beautiful example. Everybody take a breath. Just so you know, I'm going to invite you to take a couple of breaths during my sharing today. And so before we dive into it, and somebody as I was walking around said, I really miss your jokes. I swear they did. And I have two jokes. One's an oldie but a goodie, and the other one is a newer one. And based on what happened last Sunday with the jokes, I'm going to go with the one that's been tried and true. So there was the opening of a new store, and the woman who opened up the store received this wonderful bouquet of flowers for it, and she was really grateful for it. And as she opened up the card, all of a sudden she was confused because it actually said, with deepest sympathies. So she was confused, she was a little shocked, and at the same time, all of a sudden the phone rings, and she picks up the phone, and it's the actual florist calling to apologize that they had sent her the wrong bouquet with the wrong card on it. And the woman says, well, it's okay, like mistakes happen, no big deal. It's like, oh no, it's a big deal. I sent your flowers to the funeral, and that card said, congratulations on your new location. It was good that I went with the tried and true one. It was good, okay. That might be the last laugh you have for a while, because I want to talk to you about something that has been in my heart to share with you for a while now. And I haven't necessarily felt comfortable even sharing about it, partly because maybe I've just in my mind thought that I haven't dealt with it as much as other people have. And that is the subject of grief. Because I know that there are many people in this very room that have experienced a deep level of grief. Some of you are going through traumas, and you're in the journey. Now, I've been on that journey too, and in my mind I've thought, well, my parents are still with me, my sister, my husband. I got choked up at the earlier service when I almost said my son, and just even the thought of saying that out loud, brought up some struggles within me, right? And so I want you to know that that's what we're going to talk about. And you come to Unity on the Bay, I believe, to experience joy, to feel fulfilled, to be reminded of truth, and you take it with you. And I want to share with you that my intention today is that you do experience those things, and it's a heavier subject than we normally would talk about here, or in this way. My intention and my affirmation is that you leave today recognizing the power of God in your life, in our life, and that there is some healing that takes place. Are you with me on that? Okay. Because grief really is a universal experience. If you think about it, none of us will get through life without experiencing grief. And there are times in our lives where we experience really deep grief. There are times in our lives where we experience some level of grief, and it's part of the human condition. It's part of the human experience, and it shows up in many different ways. Right? So a lot of times when we think about grief, it goes to the loss of a loved one. And how many of us in this very room have experienced that level of grief? And by the way, that's what mostly I'll be talking to you about today. If you haven't experienced that level of grief, or it's not alive in you, I also invite you to just realize and consider the other ways in which we experience grief, like grief of something that brought us joy or a sense of love that we may not be experiencing anymore, an experience or individuals that brought us a sense of safety and connection, as we talk about Israel and what's going on in Gaza, right? Like I realize that may also bring up grief around the idea of safety and how we are in relationship to each other. There's changes that we experience where we lose the life that we had once known, and maybe we are even comfortable thinking about the life that we want to experience, and there's a level of loss, maybe a job, a way of being, a circle of friends, whatever that may be. And so we all, do you agree, move through different levels and different experiences that bring about grief within us, yes? And so what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that grief? And in many ways, we're invited to really allow for it. Brené Brown, in her book, Atlas of the Heart, she says, to be human is to know sadness. Owning our sadness is courageous and a necessary step in finding our way back to ourselves and each other. So how many times have we felt sadness, have we felt grief, and we've tried to quickly get out of it? Whether it's through an affirmation, cancel, or trying to avoid it by thinking about something else, right? And one of the things that I love now as we are moving through Atlas of the Heart as part of our Spirit Groups program is that Brené Brown actually invites us, and I believe we're at a place of spiritual intelligence and emotional intelligence to say, wait a minute, this is an experience that I am meant to move through, and that there is something deep within this experience that not only makes me realize that this is part of the human condition, but this is part of the spiritual journey. Because as we allow ourselves to move through the human condition, it continues to open up for us, if we are willing and allow it, spiritual truths and opportunities to get deeper into what we say we believe and how we say we are one with the divine, with the power of love, with the power of peace, with the power of resiliency that is within us. Now, as a minister, I have spent countless times next to a casket, speaking to somebody as they've lost their loved one, a husband, a wife, children, just the experience of somebody, a physical loss that they've had. And I recognize through those experiences and my own experiences that grief, it takes a hold of so many aspects of who we are, right? Because we feel grief at a physical, within our body level. Don't we? If you've experienced some grief, you get short of breath maybe, or when it comes up, there is an ache. Maybe our knees get a little weaker, right? And so we have a physical experience when we move through and as we move through grief. But there's also the emotional journey that we take with it. And again, I want to remind us that there is the spiritual journey that we take with us. So it affects and is sustained by so many different aspects of who we are. And this grief as a spiritual practice, it's because for me, I believe it's part of our soul's journey. It's part of our soul's evolution. It's what opens us up more fully to experience a greater sense of love. Because when we get closed up to not wanting to experience loss or pain or anguish, we are also closing ourselves off to experiencing all that life is and the truth of life, which is love and connection and oneness. And we don't have to necessarily be asking for it to be taken from us. So many times, maybe you are somebody that's experienced this, when we're moving through grief, it's like getting on your hands and knees and praying, like, take this from me. And what I've come to realize is that I don't think that those prayers work. It's not taken from us. And the prayer for me is, be with me as I move through this. God, experience and essence of love, be with me as I move through this time. Because grief really has to run its course, and there are no shortcuts to grief. How many of you have wanted a shortcut to grief? You're not going to get it here. But what I do want to share with you is that as we allow ourselves to move through the journey of grief, we will be stronger for it. We will know God's love more deeply for it. Now, I believe that it's in the room. And like I said, I've been wanting to talk about this for a while and wasn't sure how to do it or feeling comfortable enough to do it. And sure, God puts the chapter on grief in my plate, for me to share with you. But the reality is that many of us in this very room know that we as a spiritual community have been moving through certain levels of grief, individually and collectively. It was not just it was like a last year around the same time where Reverend Chris Jackson, our senior minister for over 16 years, retired and left. And so there is the physical loss of Reverend Chris Jackson as a physical entity at Unity on the Bay. And then a few months after that, many of you know that one of our pillars of the community, Aaron Moore, passed away. And a few months after that, his wife Tina passed away. And a few months after that, or in between that, there were many members of our community that many of us feel connected to and love and appreciate, who had tremendous loss of a parent or a loved one also. And so there's this, and then we had Reverend Bill Cameron pass away too. So there's just been a lot of that moving around in our community, so much so, and I hope you don't get offended by this, but at the staff level, we would just like look at each other, getting all these, calls and needing to be with people, and we just, can we just get a christening? Can somebody just call us and get us a christening soon, please, please. That was our prayer. And I think we are stronger as a community as we have leaned on each other through these times. We have leaned on each other, and grief is one of those things where it sometimes feels bearable, right? And sometimes it feels like it's totally engulfing us. Sometimes grief feels like a journey in joy, remembering the joy that individuals have brought into our lives. And sometimes it's a feeling of anguish and sorrow because the physicality of that individual is no longer in our lives. And so there's all these different emotions and different ways of experiencing our grief. Khalil Gibran, he says that when you are sorrowful, to look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. And so again, it's that way of being able to recognize that yes, sorrow can be deep within us, anguish can be deep within us, and it is an expression of the love and the joy that we have experienced before, and the love and joy that we can trust and have faith we will experience again. He also says that the deeper the sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. And so to me, that reminds me, right? Like it's all just breaking us open. The joys breaks us open to experience more of each other. The sorrows and the loss and the grief breaks us even more open so that we can experience more connection and more awareness, not only of God, but the people that are in our lives and the way that they express that love of God. What I can tell you is that those words may bring some of you comfort. And some of you may only be experiencing them as words because you're in the midst of it. What I can tell you is that grief, for me, really invites us to move into the place where all healing takes place. The first space where healing is possible is when we surrender. And so maybe we've been conditioned in the past to avoid it or control it or minimize some of the sadness, sorrow, or grief. And we are being invited to surrender to it. Because the moment that we no longer fight it and the moment that we surrender to it, all of a sudden we are able to see and experience the truth of that experience and those relationships in a more conscious way. And so we tend to fight it, we tend to control it, but that just keeps us stuck. And that just keeps us constricted, right? How many of us have experienced some level of sorrow and grief, and we convince ourselves that we're okay? How are you doing? Okay. Ask yourself, how am I doing? No, I'm okay. Anybody been there, done that? Yeah, we're okay. You know what the trouble is, and I love that Brene Brown talks about this, is that when we all of a sudden try to minimize it and say that we're okay, we try to control things to be perfect. Because now all of a sudden the perfectionism shows up, because if we show any kind of imperfection or even a crack in the I'm okay, that's where the grief shows up, because we can't push it away, and we can hold it, we can try to push it aside, but it'll eventually show up, because it is meant to not only show up, it is meant to be part of the healing process for us. It is meant to be part of the spiritual journey, and we can't keep ourselves from evolving spiritually. We can't keep ourselves from moving through whatever challenges, difficulties, beauty and wonderful experiences that are there for us, because it is meant for us to use to recognize more fully the presence of God and the presence of love in our lives. We become closed off sometimes too, and we stop ourselves from being vulnerable. How many of us have been in grief or sorrow, and we think to ourselves, I can't cry anymore, or I can't cry in front of this person. I can't cry at Unity on the Bay, at church today, right? Men deal with it, because men aren't supposed to cry, but women deal with it also because you can't be too emotional, right? And so we're stuck in this place of not being able to really acknowledge the feelings that are taking place within us. And all those feelings and the process of grief is meant for us. It is meant to be the healing itself that we are looking for. And so it's difficult sometimes to talk about grief. Maybe that's part of why I also had some hesitancy, because the world sometimes feels uncomfortable with it. How many of you are a little uncomfortable with it now? Right? Take a deep breath. God is here. We are resilient. We are strong in our faith. And we're experiencing grief. A few years ago, we found out, so many of you know that my son, I have an almost 11-year-old son, who is adopted, and we've been very open about his adoption with him since the beginning. It's usually a little hard to keep the adoption from him when it's two gay dads at home, right? So you kind of have to talk about it. But we've been very open with him about it, and we've been very open about his birth mother. Now, he only was with her for about 5 days before we adopted him. So he didn't really have a very conscious relationship with his mother. And he would ask about her all the time. And we would share with him what we knew about her. And we came to find out that his birth mother had actually passed away. It was tough because we knew that he was going to ask us about it, right? And we didn't want to lie. And sure enough, he did. And let me tell you, I mean, he was 7 years old maybe at the time. He grieved her deeply. More than I ever thought was possible for a kid that only knew his mom for the first 5 days of his birth. But he had tears in his eyes. At night, I would go into his bedroom and sometimes find him just crying and telling me that it's not fair that she had passed away. And all I could do as my heart was breaking for him was hold space for him and be very aware that whatever I did in that moment could condition him to not allow himself to feel grief, to feel sadness, to be comfortable with some of the things that will take place. And let me tell you, it was such a beautiful experience to be able to hold that space. And it makes me question how I hold that space for myself. How do you hold that space for yourself when you are moving through grief? For other individuals, right? Are you so uncomfortable that it all of a sudden becomes where you're not only avoiding some of your grief, but you're avoiding other people's griefs and other people's sorrows? And so this is really an opportunity to be very vulnerable and be in the connection with each other and with ourselves. Imagine getting to that place of vulnerability and allowing that grief to find a place within you, and that you honor that space that it has within you, that you don't hide it or ignore it or pretend that it does not exist. And we can pretend all we want, but again, we can get busy, we can do the to-do list, we can try to keep ourselves, thinking about other things, and it'll rise up, it'll show up, because it is meant for us to experience in a way that brings us closer to remembering that God is always with us. C.S. Lewis, who was the writer, who was also a widower, his wife actually passed of cancer, said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. But are we willing to hear those shouts? And what is God shouting for us? I believe that one of the things that God shouts to us in those moments is that life is eternal and that our connection with each other is eternal. And it's asking us to keep our hearts open and be willing to also see the signs that life is eternal. How many of you have experienced a great loss in your life of a loved one, and when you are willing to see it, all of a sudden see signs from beyond that tell you they're okay and they're still with you? But we have to be willing to feel into that, and we have to be willing to look for the signs. I believe that God is also showing us and shouting to us that love has not left us. Sometimes we feel when the moments that we are in grief that love has left us. And the beautiful thing is, as we are told in the Bible, love is patient. Love is always there, and love will be patient enough to wait for us to allow it. And it also endures all things. So the more that we allow that love, the more we're able to move through whatever grieving process or journey that we are in. And the other thing I believe that God is shouting to us is that it's okay not to understand. It's okay not to understand our grief. It's okay not to understand what happens after death. It's okay to not understand what may be going through or how the process will be for you, how long the journey will be for you in grief. It's okay to not understand that we can be okay with the mysteries of life, and it doesn't change the fact that there is the divine wisdom that is carrying us and holding us through the experiences. Even Jesus, right? Like this master teacher that we have, that we know, like, knew his oneness with God and knew his truth more likely better than anyone that came before him and better than anyone that's come after him. He knew that God and he were fully one, and he knew that he was being taken care of, and he wept. The shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. And Jesus wept when he was told and went to see Lazarus, his friend who had died. And it is then that it shows up, and he shows up to be with Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. And what that tells me is that, see, he wept, and he was also a consoling presence to Mary and Martha. And we have both those attributes and those energies within us, that we can cry, that we can feel, that we can be in sorrow. And within us is the Christ nature that also brings us comfort and strength and lifts us up. We don't have to choose between both. We actually can embody both of them and allow both of them to be part of the journey and the process for us. And so we can lean on your Christ nature, not to take the grief away, but to actually be with us in our grief, to console our tears, to lift us up when we're in anguish, to remind us that as we move through grief, we are never alone. And that's the interesting thing, right? Like, when we are in the midst of grief, like, we sometimes feel very lonely, and grief is such a universal experience. So many of us have moved through all these different levels of grief that we don't have to be alone in it. And we can lean on each other as a spiritual community, with friends, with family, and with the Christ of our being through it. It isn't about shifting ourselves out of grief or avoiding it. It's about allowing it and bringing us to a place of remembrance. Remembering the love, remembering the truth, remembering the resiliency that Ray was singing about, the strength of our divine nature and the strength of our relationship with God. Reverend Ogun Holder, he talks about this, that this is what healing is about. He says to heal is to make peace with what is, to cease struggling against a current experience, and to release any desire that the loss never happened or that it will never happen. See, we grieve even before the loss. We sometimes grieve knowing that there may be a loss, and that's okay. And whether we're in the midst of it, or we are just getting a sense of it, or it's big, deep, or in small bouts, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And whether our own experiences is one of grief and feeling disconnected, we can trust in the presence of God. It says in Psalm 73:26, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Take a breath with me. Tell yourself it's okay. Turn to somebody near you and say, God is here. Turn to somebody else and say, God is tender. Now take another deep breath. Just say to yourself, love is here. And so what I can tell you, if you are moving through grief or for when you are experiencing grief, is to lean on that love, to lean on that presence, to remember that you are loved and that love is around you, and that in moments of grief that you can simply allow that grief to be held in the container of the divine love that is within you and within the heart of God. And through that, you'll move through it because you're resilient. You are the power of love, and the strength of God is with you always. moving you to a place of honoring what has been, honoring the truth of what is, and honoring the truth of what will be. I'm going to invite you, if you feel comfortable, and there is a specific individual that has been pulling at your heartstrings as we talk about grief, somebody that may have left this physical plane, to bring them to mind, and if you feel comfortable, just gently close your eyes, bringing them to mind, allowing whatever comes up to come up, and remembering the truth of this experience, and speak to that individual silently to yourself. I have loved you. I miss you. And you are with me. And I love you. Open your eyes. Hold on to the love. Hold on to the presence of God. Hold on to the faith. Hold on, and you will be held. Namaste. Thank you so much for visiting our YouTube channel. We post new videos every week to keep you positive, present, and inspired to your divinity. Please click on the subscribe button below and also that notification bell. Remember to share this with your friends and your family, those that you know will be inspired just like you have been. And always remember that we love you, that we bless you, that we behold the Christ in you, and we see you doing great things. Thanks and take care.